The PS5 was promised to be a true next-gen experience, yet 2 years later, it still hasn't reached its potential. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed the PS5, but at the same time, there really is no reason to own one yet. The PS5 may be a vast improvement over the PS4, but unless you're a nerd who actually cares about specs, then chances are, you most likely won't care about what it really has to offer. This is a problem that a lot of next-gen consoles have faced, especially after the jump from HD. Back then, it was amazing seeing how far games have progressed, especially when games went from looking like this to this. So while the PS5 may look amazing, it really isn't that big of a jump from the PS4 in the grand scheme of things. So I kinda wanna go over my mixed thoughts on the PS5, and why I think it's disappointing so far. Going into the next generation, Sony was miles ahead of the competition. They had dominated the previous console generation, especially after the Xbox One shat the floor.
Xbox, watch TV. TV.
New Kinect sensor paired with every Xbox One.
We have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
$499 in the US.
The PS4 was the console to get if you wanted great exclusives and the better console in general. So when the next console generation was on the horizon, people were excited about the next PlayStation and what games it was gonna offer, and it kinda delivered. The PS5 during its reveal had a lot of promising games, including a remake of Demon's Souls, a game that was only previously available to the PS3, a downright beautiful sequel to Ratchet & Clank that looked to be taking advantage of the new hardware, and a sequel/expansion to Spider-Man that was going to be available on day one. While the design was very interesting, it proved to be something that actually may be worth the $500 asking price. It's only a shame that retailers proceeded to blunder the pre-orders. This is something that almost everyone knows now, but for a good while, getting your hands on a PS5 proved to be extremely annoying since most retailers weren't really clear on when pre-orders would go live, causing the first batch of PS5s to sell out the instant they went live. This normally wouldn't be so bad since you could just go to a store and get one, but oops, this console was going to be released during a global pandemic, meaning that stores weren't going to sell PS5s in stores, so the only way to get them was by pre-ordering online. This caused PS5s to sell out the instant they went live. I was one of the lucky few to actually pre-order on day one due to the sheer luck of my friend telling me at the right time, but this wasn't the case for most people as the console continued to be out of stock for an eternity. It didn't help that scalpers seemed to have a lock on the entire market, buying out entire lots of them and reselling them for as much as 3 times its original price. Even a year after its release, they were still hard to come by. This was mostly the fault of the chip shortage at the time, making the manufacturing of these consoles to be scarce, and it has only just been recently resolved as PS5s have finally become more readily available. I bring this up since this has inadvertently become part of the PS5's legacy. Just the fact that most people had to jump over many obstacles made this console an unusual commodity to even be able to get. But once you finally got your hands on a PS5, you will soon realize just how awesome the console was. It had improved on seemingly everything. Games finally gave you the option to run at a crisp 60 FPS. All games had vastly improved load times. It was backwards compatible with the PS4, and sometimes even improved those games. This truly felt like everything fans wanted, but even with all these vast improvements, the console is still lacking in a lot of ways. And despite how powerful it is, there really isn't a reason to upgrade to one just yet. I think it's important to bring up all the PS5's exclusive at the time of this recording, which includes the following. Except oops, some of these games are playable on PS4. This is the real list of exclusives, but oops again, some of these titles have since been ported over to PC, leaving this paltry amount of true PS5 exclusives. This normally wouldn't be that big of an issue, but it's been 2 years so far in this console's life cycle, and we only got a handful more confirmed exclusives that are coming to this console. Again, I know the main reason why a small amount of games have been released is due to COVID, but it still feels like it isn't worth the price of admission, especially if you own a decent enough PC that could run some of these games. But maybe don't play The Last of Us Part 1 on PC. Despite this, I do think if you're excited to play some of these exclusives, or if you're not interested in buying a PC, then it's still a good console to buy, but the fact that so little games are actually coming out is just a bit of a disappointment, especially if you don't happen to be interested in any of these upcoming games. This has just been largely a problem with how AAA gaming has become, ballooning to such ridiculous proportion that it now takes a decade for a game to even be developed. Just look at Rockstar, who used to publish multiple games in a single decade, now only being reduced to just PS1 and porting over the same game over and over and over again. There's still an active development for the new GTA, and we're not even really sure when that's gonna come out. But the fact that it's taking longer and longer makes it being excited for some of these games to be trivial. Does anyone even remember that Elder Scrolls 6 was announced way back in 2018 and we still haven't heard anything about it since? And this doesn't even take into consideration if the game even works on release. Another annoying trend that the PS5 has seemingly adopted was charging $70 for most new games. For the past couple decades, games have stayed at a consistent $60, which is already a bit much, but even harsher when most games that release nowadays have a higher chance of not working. It also sucks that this was the generation that prices were raised, and it makes most games that come out for that price to almost be a slap to the face. Especially with the last gen versions of those games are still $60. This isn't just a problem for consoles either, since even PC games have started to go up for that price as well. Even Nintendo decided to up their price for the new Legend of Zelda game, and they haven't even started a new generation yet. Point being, games are already expensive, and making them cost more feels especially scummy, since you know this was most likely an executive decision to give gaming companies more money. But what I think is the most disheartening and disappointing about the PS5 is learning that developers have already started to scale down on their console ports with seemingly inferior versions. It has already been confirmed that multiple games are going to run at a crunchy 30 FPS on consoles, which isn't bad in itself, but the fact that these next-gen consoles were touted to be extremely powerful are already having issues with upcoming games is a bit disappointing. It's also annoying that even some of the exclusives have already seen issues with even maintaining a proper frame rate. Again, this normally wouldn't be such a huge issue, but the PS5 was marketed with how powerful its hardware was, and not even 2 years later, it's already starting to have performance issues. Despite all of this, it's not all doom and gloom. The PS5 still has a lot going for it. The fact that it's not only backwards compatible, but even improves on some of the older titles is a great feature and helps expand on the somewhat lackluster amount of exclusives. If you don't own the best of PCs, this is also a great alternative to being able to experience those games, and in some cases can even be the most stable version. I was also being a bit facetious with some of the exclusives since it could take up to a year for them to even be ported over to PC. So if you really want to play some of these games, especially on release, then of course that's totally a valid reason to get one. I want to talk about some of the few exclusives that the PS5 has. The Demon's Souls remake is downright amazing in my opinion. It's as faithful of a remake as you want it to be, while still making some nice quality of life improvements that makes this game feel more like its modern day counterparts. The game is also gorgeous, with environments feeling grand and detailed despite this being one of the smaller games in terms of the Soulsborne genre. This game also takes advantage of the PS5's hardware, with the almost seamless load times. I'm not sure how others feel about it, but I feel like this is definitely the definitive way to experience this game. It's a great technical achievement and a must-have for any Souls fan who still hasn't played the original. Spider-Man Miles Morales is an interesting title since this game really isn't a true sequel or DLC, rather a weird in-between game. It's definitely not as long as its original game, but it has more than enough content to make this game worthwhile. It's also a lot more difficult than the original game, or maybe it's just because I'm terrible at these type of games. This game runs amazingly on the PS5, once again taking advantage of the hardware and basically having no real load times. This game has since been ported over to PC and was also available on PS4 on launch, but this was still a great game to show off the PS5's capabilities. I have yet to try some of these other games due to being poor, but luckily the PS5 came preloaded with a fun little game called Astros Playroom. This is a fun little 3D platformer that shows off one of the PS5's most underutilized mechanics, the controller itself. This feature was heavily marketed back when the PS5 was first released. It basically gave you haptic feedback throughout the entirety of the controller, which allowed players to feel the game rolled through the controller. For example, if the game asked you to pull on a bow and an arrow, the controller would add a little bit of resistance as you were actually pulling on a real life bow. Or if you walked through a rough terrain, the controller would change vibrations to mimic the feel of that terrain. It's a bit hard to describe, but that feature was really cool and this game takes full advantage of it. Not only is it an overglorified demo, it's also an overglorified celebration of the PlayStation brand as a whole, full with fun little callbacks and references of the entire history of PlayStation. The game also takes place inside a PS5, which is just adorable, and it's not long at all. I definitely recommend every PS5 owner play this. It kinda makes you forget that you spent over $500 to play it. Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, The Last of Us Part 1 and 2, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and many more are all some of the great titles to play on the console. Not to mention all the third-party support that makes this console worth picking up if again, you don't own the most up-to-date PC. So despite all my bitching, the PS5 is still a good console. But it hasn't turned into a great console just yet, which is why it makes it so disappointing. Still, I hope that this console will become better in the near future. With the release of Spider-Man 2, which looks to be taking full advantage of the hardware, I feel like I've been saying that a lot, and being fully exclusive to PS5, as well as all the promising amount of titles that are confirmed to be coming out, it looks like the console might not have to wait long to feel great. Now please Sony, let us have Fiends back. It's been 2 years and I want to change my goddamn Fiends.
Genji 2 is an action game which is based on Japanese history. The stages of the game will also be based on famous battles which actually took place in ancient Japan. So here's this giant enemy crab.